Today, we're diving into a mystery that's hit all of our wallets. We are going to unpack the story behind why prices went through the roof across the globe, all based on some fascinating research from Diajawani and his colleagues. Right? It's the question we've all been asking ourselves pretty much every time we buy anything. To really get to the bottom of it, we've got to treat this like a detective story. We're going to look for the clues that solve the case of the crazy price hikes. Okay, let's get into it. So, our first clue is all about understanding just how different this whole crisis was. The economic shock from the pandemic was truly like nothing we'd ever seen, not even the huge financial crisis back in 2008. See, the 2008 crisis was kind of like a synchronized collapse. Everything went down at once. But the pandemic, it was this weird rolling wave of shutdowns and reopenings. It was completely uneven, totally unpredictable, and it smashed into different parts of the economy in totally different ways. Now, I know these graphs look a little intense, but they show something really important. The chart on the left, that's world trade. It took a big hit from COVID, sure, but it bounced back pretty fast. Now, the chart on the right, that's overall economic activity, or GDP. And that drop was way, way deeper than what we've seen in other recessions. This was not your typical downturn. So here's the bottom line. We saw this massive collapse in what we were all doing and buying, but global trade itself got back on its feet surprisingly quickly. And that weird mismatch? Well, that's the key that unlocks our next clue. Okay, so that brings us to clue number 2. While the world was in lockdown, we all changed how we lived. And that led to this giant unprecedented switch in what we were actually spending our money on. This chart here really shows you what that looked like, especially in the US. We basically stopped spending money on services, like going out to eat, traveling, concerts, and we started buying stuff. While spending on services just fell off a cliff, spending on things like new laptops, cars, and furniture absolutely surged, way past where it was before the pandemic. We completely changed what we bought. I mean, it's really as simple as that. The service economy, the part that relies on us being face-to-face, it just shut down. So all that money we would have spent, plus a lot of government stimulus, it had to go somewhere, and it went into buying physical goods. And this chart just hammers that point home. Look at services, total collapse. But then look at durable goods. That spending didn't just bounce back, it exploded. And this created this huge sudden demand for physical products, which leads us right to our third and final clue. All of this sudden, massive demand for things slammed headfirst into the global system that's supposed to make and ship all that stuff, the world's supply chains. And here is a key finding from the researchers. They said this: tilting of our spending put unbelievable stress on a system that was already shaky from lockdowns and worker shortages. The system just wasn't designed to handle a switch that big, that fast. And this model shows you the direct result. When that red line, the global supply chain pressure index, shot through the roof, it means shipping costs were soaring and delays were getting longer. And look what followed right behind it: inflation. The connection is just undeniable. The system was breaking, and prices started climbing because of it. The best way to think about it is like a planet-sized traffic jam. Way too many people were trying to buy stuff, and there just weren't enough open lanes, or ships, or ports, or workers to get it all delivered. And when demand outruns supply that badly, prices have nowhere to go but up. Okay, so we have our clues: a totally unique shock, a crazy spending switch, and supply chains that just snapped under the pressure. Now it's time to get to the verdict. What or who was the main culprit behind all this inflation? The researchers' model really breaks it down into two main suspects. On one hand, you've got demand shocks, basically too much money chasing too few goods, partly thanks to stimulus. And on the other hand, you've got supply shocks, all those bottlenecks we just talked about. So, which was it? Well, for the euro area, the verdict is a tie. The model shows it was basically a 50-50 split. Half the inflation came from supply-side problems, and the other half came from demand-side pressures. But then you look across the Atlantic to the United States, and you get a really different picture. In the US, demand shocks were the big story. They were responsible for about 2/3 of the spike in inflation, while supply shocks played a smaller but still pretty important role. So this is the really crucial point. Even though inflation was happening everywhere, the reasons why were actually pretty different depending on where you lived. The way the US responded put a ton more pressure on the demand side of the whole equation. And you can't forget just how connected our world is. The research showed that for Europe, Especially, you couldn't explain the price hikes just by looking at what was happening at home. Shocks from other countries spilling over through trade were actually responsible for about half of their inflation problem. So, after all that, what's the big picture here? What has this whole economic detective story really taught us about the way our world works? It really was a perfect storm, right? You had this sequence of events. First, a once-in-a-century health crisis brings the service economy to a halt. Then that causes this once-in-a-century spending switch, and that switch collides with a supply chain that was built for predictable, normal times, not for a sudden, chaotic explosion in demand. And this final quote from the paper just sums it all up perfectly. All those stimulus policies wouldn't have caused nearly as much inflation if the world's ability to make and ship things hadn't been broken at the exact same time. It was the combination of the two that was just so powerful. In the end, this whole price puzzle was a massive stress test, and it showed us all the cracks in our globalized economy. It showed us exactly where the breaking points are. So the real question now is, have we learned the right lessons to build a stronger, more resilient system for whatever shock comes next?